Welcome to another episode of Books in the World, a product of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I'm Kathy Aspden. Today, I'm happy to be here with Chris McLaughlin. Chris is the founder and executive director of the Animal Rescue Front. She's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, with a bachelor's in earth sciences, and she lives in Eastham, Massachusetts. Chris has written an extraordinary memoir entitled Mississippi Barking, Hurricane Katrina and a Life That Went to the Dogs. It was published and came out earlier this year in August by the University Press of Mississippi. The University Press of Mississippi. As most people know, Hurricane Katrina hit Louisiana and Mississippi as a Category 5 hurricane in August 29th of 2005. It demolished the city of New Orleans and devastated the Gulf Coast of Mississippi and Louisiana. In its wake, more than 1 million people were displaced. Over 2,000 people perished, and at an estimate of 250,000 animals, 250,000 animals of all kinds were killed. The news footage for it was worldwide, but not so for the animals. Mississippi Barking is the story of Chris's personal journey to rescue as many animals as possible. Thank you so much, Chris, for being here.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to start by saying I really enjoyed your memoir. I enjoyed how much, not just the information that was in it, but how much it touched me as a human, to have that kind of compassion for animals and to be able to act on it. It was a time in history where we all wanted to do something and we didn't know what to do. And tell me a little bit about your recon work that you did were you living in Cambridge at the time?
I was in North Truro.
North Truro, okay.
When
and
Katrina
you did
struck.
some recon work for some of the shelters and some of the rescue before you ever stepped foot in Mississippi or Louisiana.
Yes.
So,
yes. My sister went down shortly after the hurricane when the city was still flooded.
Okay.
And she went down to help the animals when the city was basically under lock and key. You couldn't get in unless you were some type of first responder, and animal rescue did fall under that category. And she was literally breaking down doors of homes that were flooded, or had been flooded, had been demolished, where they knew animals had been left behind. And one morning she called me, desperate, and said, "We have 6,600 addresses in the greater New Orleans area, and we have 100 volunteers that are here to help animals. Please try to get us some help." And I sent out an email to an email group that we had comprised of some of her friends, some of mine. Most of them had donated money to her so that she could go down and do this work. And I pleaded, I just said, please send this email on to everyone you know, and then ask them to send it on to everyone they know. And within about 2.5 hours, I had 4 phone calls. One from a deaf woman in Florida who did rescue work with her dog, recovery work with her dog. A woman on the Mississippi Gulf Coast who was impacted by the hurricane, and then a couple on Long Island, the O'Maras, and Jerry O'Mara was one of the firefighters at Ground Zero.
And he was there already?
No, they were all at home.
Okay.
They were all at home, and they basically said, "Where do we go? What can we do?"
Okay.
And then I had to figure that out.
Oh, you know what? When you said Ground Zero, I was thinking about
Hound Zero. You
Hound
were thinking
Zero.
Hound Zero, yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which became the name
Right.
of your location.
Right.
Yes, okay. So, and at that point, the work that you were doing was mostly finding shelters, processing information, trying to get as many rescue situations going as possible.
So I was trying to find out who was working in the city to help animals. There was one location that was a Winn-Dixie, and they had turned the parking lot into an animal shelter. There were a number of places. There was Jane Garrison's group, which is ultimately where I ended up in the Lower Garden District. Didn't know anything about Mississippi at this point because no one ever talks about Mississippi. It's at one point the Weather Channel actually referred to it as the landmass between Louisiana and Alabama.
It was definitely...
It was kicked to the curb.
Yes, it was. Well, New Orleans took such a precedence when it came to the publicity and the information and the need that everyone was rushing to look to New Orleans.
Everyone was going to New Orleans.
Yeah, and you forget that the entire Gulf Coast, really, of Mississippi was devastated. So when you finally made the decision that you yourself were going to go and be right on the ground doing the rescue work, what did you have for resources? What did you have for knowledge? I mean, when I read this book and you literally you're in a car by yourself, driving down to Mississippi, which is a ghost land at this point.
Right.
And you're trying to find this one particular shelter that you're going to stop at first on your way to where you're going to stay.
Yes.
Actually, tell me a little bit about that, about what you brought, how you managed.
I had a sleeping bag. I had a Costco first aid kit. I had a big box of milk bones.
Yeah.
And when I got to Mobile, Alabama, which was the last civilization, I bought a 6-pack of Starbucks coffee in the cans.
Wow.
And a small cooler and ice. And that's what I had when I headed
All right, so that's
west.
Let me just say, very brave. Okay.
Or stupid. I don't know.
No, I'm going to say it was very, very brave. I mean, you went down there with the hope that you were going to join an organization and they were going to have some kind of volunteer rescue thing in place so that you could be helpful to them. You weren't going down there to start a community. You were going down there to join a community.
Right.
And so as a surprise to me reading your book, actually there were a lot of things that were surprising. I thought I knew pieces about animal rescue based on the fact that my mother and my sister both have rescue dogs. I'm certainly aware of the whole process, but not. Because in my mind, for one thing, I thought that anytime you had a shelter, it was based in compassion and kindness, and the animals were cared for. And your first experience with the shelter that you went down there on your way to where people were having the volunteer setup was devastating. It was just horrific. And I know that there's pictures in your book, there's pictures that are outside of your book that don't do it justice of how bad the conditions were. But tell me what you found when you finally, you get in the car and you drive straight there, right? Sleeping in your car.
I spent one night in a hotel in North Carolina.
Oh, all right, okay. Because
Yeah.
that sounds like it's pretty much, other than when you had 22 dogs with you, it was the only hotel, I think that
It was the only hotel for a long time.
Yes, it was, right, exactly. There was a lot of sleeping in the truck and all of that. But then you get down to this shelter that's unmanned at the time that you get there. Like you walk in and there's not a soul there except, what do you find?
There were 17 dogs, 21 cats. There was one light bulb hanging in the doorway. I did not know at the time, but the facility had been condemned by the Corps of Engineers because it flooded from Katrina. It was only a mile from the Gulf Coast.
Wow.
And the truth about Katrina is Katrina devastated Mississippi. What devastated New Orleans were the floods that were man-made.
Right.
They were man-made because the Corps of Engineers had basically demolished a lot of the coastline of Louisiana. And they had created this canal, if you will, called the Mr. Go. And what happened was when the floodwaters came, it went right up the Mr. Go, unimpeded to Lake Pontchartrain, and that's what started flooding the levees.
Right.
If there had not been that situation, Katrina would have only been about Mississippi.
Right.
And a few shingles blown off the Superdome in New Orleans. But because of the failure of the levees, because of the canal, it became synonymous with Hurricane Katrina. When in fact, what happened east of the Pearl River, which is the natural boundary between Louisiana and Mississippi, what happened east of there, and Waveland is just east of there, 87% of the town was
washed away.
Gone.
Yeah.
The fire department, the town hall, the post office, Home Depot, Walmart, gone. The Bay St. Louis Bridge was destroyed. A huge, huge bridge.
Yeah.
Well,
in fact, people have asked me when I've mentioned this book, why is it called Mississippi Barking? Like they're kind of like, where is the New Orleans piece in that? Like it almost, that's information that a lot of people don't really have.
Right.
When you look at a shelter like Waveland, it was mostly people would find a dog, the dog would be a stray, the police would pick up a dog, the military would pick up a dog, and they'd go to Waveland.
Yeah.
And then there was nothing really being done to take care of them.
Very little.
Very little being done.
Yeah, very little.
I know that you focused a lot on rescuing those dogs and trying to
get them out.
Get them out.
We had to get them out.
Yeah.
If we didn't get them out, they wouldn't have. They would have put them down.
Yeah. And so throughout the 2 years, you were back and forth to Waveland, kind of like.
Constantly.
Yes. Let me see what they have going on now and what I can replace, what I can place into a different home, what we can adopt out, what we can put in rented vans and drive back to Massachusetts. Let me ask you a little bit about, so there were a lot of enemies when it comes to Hurricane Katrina. You know, the timing, the weather, the fact that it turned, the proximity of developments close to areas of flooding. There were so many. And so you don't expect the other things that also become pretty antagonistic, like the fact that you have to deal with the military and whether they're going to let you into a neighborhood, or whether the police is going to recognize a rescue mission as something viable or see you as a looter or as somebody who's breaking curfew. I know you had a strong curfew to adhere to.
Yeah.
And how much did that factor in, or was it just a learning curve that you had to actually figure the rules? And
they were pretty friendly towards us, but there were times where we were concerned that, well, we would take the orange netting that they had put up to like block off certain, holes in the ground and that kind of thing. There were no cars in New Orleans, so the orange netting was kind of, it wasn't
like a moot point.
Very useful.
Yeah.
And we needed it to catch the dogs.
Right.
So there were times that we were concerned that we would be seen as looters, but when you're down in a place like that where nothing's open and you're crawling under buildings to save litters of cats and kittens and puppies, and you're literally crawling under buildings, and you have nothing to protect you.
Right.
Other than, the little gardener masks that...
No, seriously. Some of the pictures, when I looked at the pictures of like the mold-ridden buildings and you had no protection.
No protection.
I mean, it's a very brave thing to go down there. And I saw everybody working at the expense of what it was doing to their bodies, to their emotional health. And their physical health had to be. Did you have any ill effects afterward from?
No.
Oh goodness.
I didn't.
Yeah.
Other than a broken heart.
A broken heart for sure. I know that your heart was broken over and over and over again, and then there would be these glimpses of these amazing recoveries that would sustain you through it all. So it was basically a 2-year journey, but you're still going back and forth, or are you still?
We're still, the Animal Rescue Front is very much alive 16 years later. Every 2 weeks we're on the road. We depart the greater Jackson area with we own 2 vehicles now. One's a Sprinter, one's a 24-foot passenger bus. And we load them up with animals and we bring them up here to the Northeast, to shelters in the Northeast.
I know that at one point in the book you mentioned hurricane exhaustion, or I can't remember, there was another term you used for it, where people had
Compassion
stopped.
fatigue.
Yes, and it was more, the compassion was certainly on the ground in your mission, but it was more in the outer areas, people that were no longer accepting dogs, people that were no longer saying, yes, I'll take a stray, yes, I'll take a rescue dog. And yet, since Katrina, and I don't have the statistics, but when you think about how many devastating natural disasters there has been, and the need for animal rescue, all the time, and how it really wasn't a functioning event, it feels like, until Hurricane Katrina. It wasn't like an infrastructure of information and systems where you could bring dogs to a different rescue in another state, that would then adopt them out. And so it's great to have that. It needs to be said that this is a memoir. So it's your own personal journey about what drove you, and also what continues to drive you to be the compassionate human being that you are. And I know you mentioned early trauma in childhood, and I feel like it really did almost make you unable to witness helpless victims not getting what they need. And that's probably how you see every animal, is that that's me reading what I think what I was, but I could clearly see that it was so painful. So to be in the midst of so much pain, because you can almost see how people harden their hearts to do a job like that. And there were a few hard hearts.
Yes.
I mean, the woman who ran the shelter in Waveland, she was very, very not connected to the animals and not connected to their suffering, and kind of considered it, well, I'm here to house some animals, and this is what we're doing.
Yeah.
But
the town officials were the same.
Oh, really? Okay.
Well, that's where the title Mississippi Barking comes from. So it's a play on Mississippi burning.
Right.
And this Yankee woman shows up and starts saying, you're not going to do things like this anymore.
Yeah.
Over my dead
even
body.
creating the infrastructure of people that were on your side when you got down there.
Yeah.
Because at first it must have been appalling to see all these conditions, but then secondly, you knew you had to play the game. You had to find your people and figure out how on earth you were going to get them on your team when it came to doing the right thing, as opposed to just doing the easy thing. The chapter where you talk about the police just shooting animals.
Yeah.
I mean, because they were dogs running in packs because they had no food, no water, that was their survival. And then the other gentle piece, which was when you talked about how every dog that would fight you, you're trying to pull them out from under foundations, you're trying to pull them out of areas, but then the minute that they were in a safe spot where they were being touched and fed and cleaned and had water, they became a pet again.
Yes.
They were.
They did.
I don't know.
They really did.
It was a lot to read. It was such a wonderful summation of what that time must have been like. So, is this your full-time job now? Doing
writing
animals?
Or saving animals?
Well, the writing piece, you had said, you lamented that it took you a while to put that all together, but that you had such a great support system when it came to your writing. You have a team of people that were helpful because writing a memoir is tricky.
Well, I did a formal manuscript boot camp. That was a 4-day boot camp with the author Pam Houston.
Oh, right.
And, but for the most part, I was pretty much on my own with the book.
Yeah.
But yes, my full-time job is still running the organization and coordinating and, determining who down south needs to get out.
Right.
Where can they go? Are they healthy enough? Do they have the required vaccines? Have they been spayed or neutered? What's their temperament like? We also do some adoptions, so we do some direct adoptions, and like I said, we're on the road every 2 weeks, so it keeps me very busy.
And pretty much, do they all come north?
Do they all come north? A very high percentage of them do, because it only stands to reason. Let's take the state of Massachusetts. We have 7 million people, approximately. Mississippi, we have 3. And Mississippi is probably 4 times the size of Massachusetts.
Right.
So it only stands to reason that we're going to have more
People
good
that will
homes
accept that kind of home. Yes.
up here
Yes.
than we do down there. But we're also dealing still with a very rural-based agricultural mentality where animals are not valued for their lives.
I mean, we have connections to the South, and we've heard stories about people that get through hunting season and then they put their dog down because they don't want to house them and feed them through the winter. And I mean, it's unthinkable. Or dogs that are simply, no matter what the weather is, they're an outdoor dog. They've never been inside. They're not. They're definitely not considered pets by any stretch of the imagination. But it sounds like the people that lost their pets, yes, they lost their homes, their jobs, some of them lost relatives, but the pets were the last straw in their life. So when they would come to you and say, please try to find my Missy. Is Missy the dog that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Missy, yeah.
It was heartbroken to think about where they were in their lives, and all they wanted was somebody to go back to their neighborhood that no longer existed.
Yeah.
And find their dog.
Find their dog.
Yeah.
Manuel was one of the gifts, just a really amazing man that I met in New Orleans and had quite a few interactions with, and we never found his dog. But I'm very confident that she was safe because there was a picture of her with an identifying number around her, but we never found out where she went.
But you could relocate her after that, so you got, right?
Well, that wasn't something that I did.
I see.
That had happened prior to my arrival, but I was able to track that for him.
So the beautiful, heart-rendering, wrenching pictures that were taken, all the photography was Carol Guzzi, who is an award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist.
4 times.
4 times, and you can see why when you look at the photography. But she immersed herself in that situation as well. It was supposed to be just a very small little stint for her to cover.
Yep.
And then she ended up taking a leave. Was that right?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So she was in Texas on a story for the Washington Post, and her editor called her and said, you need to get to New Orleans because New Orleans had started to flood. Right. And she was taking aerial photographs before she even got on the ground.
Wow.
She was on the ground for, I think, 2 weeks. And they called her back. And she said, I can't go back.
Yeah.
There's a story here about what's going on with the animals and these people that are just leaving their lives and coming down here to help the animals. And I'm not going back. She took a leave of absence.
Wow.
And she didn't leave the area until March of 2006.
Wow. Well, I mean, I went to New Orleans in November of 2007 and did the tours and went down to the, is it the lower East
Ninth.
Ward?
Lower
Ninth Ward, yes. And I mean, I had just finished reading Chris Rose's book from the NOLA Times-Picayune. Yes. And One Dead in the Attic, which was a compilation of columns he wrote during that time.
I have it.
Oh, you do have it?
Oh, you bet.
And so, I was terrified 2.5 years later. Terrified. There were areas that I would walk through and think, how could, the barricades, the couches, the vehicles. I mean, it was heartbreaking all those years later. So I can't even imagine what it was like to be in the midst of it all.
It still looks like the lower Ninth Ward still, the detritus of people's lives has been cleaned up, but the homes,
Right.
are all falling in on each other, and it still looks very much the same
Yeah.
all these years later.
Wow. Well, it's an amazing, amazing thing that people have managed to, and they haven't really managed. I want to say people have managed to reposition their lives in other states and in other parts of the South. But you can never get back that massive, massive loss. And we're not talking houses, we're talking, lives. And the animals. I mean, you don't even think about 250,000 animals that are everything from your pet parakeet to the newborn litter that just happened to happen. And people weren't allowed to bring them to shelters.
Right.
I just want to thank you so much for this. This was such a wonderful thing that it was wonderful to read it. It was wonderful to be part of that story in that some of the places that you spoke about I had been to, that I actually, the empathy, it just all swells up in just a moment's time when you start picking up the book. Where is it that people can purchase this book? I know that it's out on just everywhere.
So local bookstores on the Cape, any local bookstore can order it.
Okay.
Anyone. It is on Amazon. The bookstores in Mississippi, the Lemuria bookstore in Jackson has signed copies, past Christian.
Well, I hope that we get some copies. I hope that we get it started in bookstores on the Cape, because we have a lot of animal lovers here.
We do.
And I'm so appreciative that you were here today.
We do.
Thank you so much, Chris.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Kathy.